Dr. Beck. And let's make sure here before you mute. Is that correct?
Yep,
What you're saying?
you've got the presenter view right there.
Okay. All right. Well, like Dr. Beck mentioned, once again, we have a wide range of yields in our wheat stands across the state this fall. We really thought things were going to look pretty good. We've had some rough years over the last 4 or 5, and I thought this might be the opportunity. But as he also correctly mentioned, I have seen some fairly good wheat stands. And those were producers that had that wheat in the ground early. They caught some of that late August moisture that was there in the soil and got those stands up and were able to keep the armyworms beat back off of it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The way I want to start this out as a segue in for Dr. Beck's portion is I think it's time we review some of the things that we know from decades of research that's going to put you ahead of the game as far as fall forage production. So we're not as worried about the grain portion here today, even though I've got a couple slides that we may address that. But this is mainly geared towards maximizing fall forage production. Again, here's some pictures. We had some county educators share these pictures with us, area specialists. Dr. Beck had a few. As you can see, kind of a mix of what we see out there, but I would say on average, most people are either behind or extremely behind where they would at least like to be at this point in the year. Now, moving forward, as Dr. Beck's going to give you some numbers about what you should expect when you're turning cattle in to wheat, I think it's important for us to understand what some of these stands look like. You know, here's an example of 200 pounds of forage dry matter per acre. You know, those plants are starting to come up. You can actually see the rows here. And let me see if I can get my pointer pulled up. I should have already done that. You can see some of these rows that are showing, but again, just not a lot of forage availability out there. 300 to 400 pounds, once again, starting to look quite a bit better. Those plants are putting on multiple leaves, 4, 5, 6 leaves per plant, maybe even starting that tillering process a little bit there. We get to 600 pounds and we're starting to get canopy closure as we get into this 600 to 800 pound ballpark. And again, in a pinch, we could turn in on some of these fields that are 600 to 800 pounds. We'd prefer to have a little bit more. I'm going to leave that for Dr. Beck to go into a little bit more detail on. But starting out here today, what I want to do is give you 6 points to think about when it comes to planting small grain pasture in the fall. And we're going to walk through those, and these are pretty much in the order of importance that we need to make an optimum forage stand. And we're going to start with moisture, and of course that's what drives everything. That's what gets us behind as well sometimes. But if we look at 30-year rainfall averages, and I know every year is not right on the average, we get into these rough years, but I like 30-year averages because that can give us confidence in what we should see on average in a long-term system. What we notice is it doesn't matter if we're in Northeast, Northwest, Southeast, or Southwest, we're all starting out at about the same point there in August. We do see the eastern part of the state get significantly more rain in September and October than the western part of the state. But there's a lot of data out there that shows if we have healthy plants and we have nutrients in the soil, it only takes about 4 inches of moisture to make a ton of production with that cool season forage. So again, if we're looking here, we should be able to do that by the end of September if we plant in early September in eastern Oklahoma. And it might take 5 to 6 weeks or so to do that in western Oklahoma, but capturing that earlier fall moisture is paramount. And that's why we see a lot of these really good looking stands for producers that got out early and got the seed in the ground. Back at the last week of August, I had a meeting in Cherokee. We were talking about winter grazing options, winter forage options, and there was a producer there that had a field in that was already about 3 to 4 inches tall. So fields like that we get in early, we can capture those rains in September and October. There's some other things we're capturing there that we're going to talk about as we get a little further into this. And that's a good segue for us to go right into this planting date. Planting date's probably one of the biggest things that affects fall forage production after the amount of moisture that we get at that location. Here's an example. I know this picture is old, but I think it really tells a story. The picture here was taken on the last day of November, and this was different planting dates. So you can see we planted September 10th, September 17th, September 23rd, October 7th, October 21st, and then November 4th. And it's very easy to visibly see the differences in yield by getting out early and getting that seed in the ground. That first planting, again, this November 10th planting here was clipped on October 27th, and it already made almost 1,900 pounds of forage per acre. We hadn't even hooked the planter up to plant this one. That was still a week down the road. So again, if we're really talking about forage production, we want to be earlier in the year. And if you're a dual purpose system where we're wanting to plant grain, there's reasons that we wait a little longer. We like to be somewhere around the 1st of October would be our ideal, just to not hurt grain yield that much. But if your sole purpose is to grow this small grain to graze out, we need to be as early in September as we possibly can to capture sunlight, capture moisture, and capture heat, and put that yield on. So this is some data here. This was about 20 years of data from a couple of our past wheat specialists, small grain specialists at OSU. There's lots of data points behind these curves you're seeing here. But what we see long term is that every day we wait after September 1 to have plants germinated and out of the ground, we lose about 50 pounds of dry matter production per acre per day. That's huge. That tells us if we're waiting to the end of September versus the 1st of September, we potentially give up 1,500 pounds of dry matter production per acre. So that would be a really big one I would tell you to keep in mind. We've got to be early in the year. Why is that so important? Again, we talked about the moisture and how we can catch some of those late August, early September showers. But the other big thing that we see is that plant needs sunlight. It needs solar radiation. It needs photons coming from the sun. Again, those leaves are like a solar panel. We're collecting that sunlight and we're converting that into energy in the plant. And we also need heat. You know, we can't grow those plants if we're super cold. So starting with sunlight, really good thing to keep in mind is that we get as much sunlight intensity in the first week of September as we get in the entire month of November. So what that tells you is these earlier plantings have a real advantage as far as their photosynthetic capability. It's much easier for them to put yield on earlier in the fall. Now, if we look at heat, what we normally look at would be heat units. So we use growing degree days as a way to predict how much growth we're going to get off of those small grain plants. And on average, and Dr. Beck's got quite a bit of good data on this through trials he's done in the past, we should expect for each growing degree day, each heat unit, we get about 3.3 pounds of dry matter per acre. And then we need to understand there's critical temperatures for our different small grain species. So for instance, wheat here, critical lower temperature is 42. So if we get below 42 as an average temperature for the day, we don't see any growth on a wheat plant. Cereal rye and triticale, for that matter, can grow in a little bit colder conditions. Their critical temperature is a little bit lower, so that gives them more potential to grow with less heat units. How do we calculate that? It's pretty easy to actually do this yourself. We just take the low temperature for the day plus the high temperature for the day, divide that by 2 to get an average temperature, and then we would subtract the critical temperature off that. So to give you a few examples here, this was a chart that Dr. Beck worked up, kind of starting at today and moving forward. What can we expect? If we look at just some estimated highs and lows, again, take the average of those and then subtract off that critical temperature. and then multiply that times 3.3 pounds for each growing degree day, we should be able to estimate how much additional forage production we're going to make into the future here. So it's a very simple process. Again, here is the example of what we might be seeing over the next 2 to 4 weeks. We're starting down here. You'll notice the blue bar is wheat that currently today has 200 pounds of dry matter per acre, based on those pictures I showed you earlier. The orange bar is cereal rye at 200 pounds per acre. And what you notice is we're going to start to see the rye gain a little more yield advantage over time because it does have that lower critical temperature. Now, how would we use this? Well, Dr. Beck's going to talk quite a bit to you here in a little bit about 1,200 pounds of forage per acre would be our ideal turnout point for a small grain pasture. And what you're going to see here is we could potentially get to that point by about the 13th of November with a rye stand if we have 600 pounds per acre today. If we have a wheat stand, it's going to take us a little bit longer, about 4 or 5 more days to hit that 1,200 pounds. And again, if we're down here, that stand's really not looking great. Maybe we just got it planted and it's just coming up. It's just a couple 100 pounds per acre today. You'll notice how much additional time that adds before we're going to be up here to this 1,200 pounds per acre turnout point. So with that in mind, we know there's going to be some of those fields that maybe we're behind. We're a little bit short of where we want to be at turnout. And that's where some of Dr. Beck's information, I think, is going to help you in the second part of this presentation. Okay, let's talk a little bit as far as planting date about emergence issues that we get into. And this is one I hear a lot. I've worked with a lot of producers in the past. This is one, and I don't mean this in a derogatory fashion, but it's one of those things that I heard my grandpa say it. I know we have old timers that say, hey, if the soil's warm, you got to plant deep. You got to plant deep to moisture. That's a very common saying. I want to show you real quick why that's not what we want to do. That's the exact opposite of what we want to do. And the reason that is because of this coleoptile. And the coleoptile is really the first stem that emerges from the seed. It's a protective structure for those leaves. It allows that plant to send those leaves up through the soil without abrading against soil particles and then get it out of the ground, and then we let the leaves start to unfurl. So again, it's a very rigid structure. It is correlated to final plant height. Here's the big one right here, this third part. High temperatures reduce the coleoptile length of most of our wheat varieties. So here's an example down here, 2 different wheat varieties. We've got one with a coleoptile length about 1.5 inches. That means that would easily get us out of the ground from 1.5 inches deep. Here's one that's about 3 inches. So really the take home from that is if we're planting deep, there are varieties that are going to have a major shortened coleoptile length. And if we shorten it too much and we've planted too deep, that plant will never get out of the ground. And let me show you a picture of that. Here's what that looks like. And we see this every year on early planted wheat that was planted deep. These plants actually end up trying to unfurl their leaf under the soil surface. And we get this accordion shaped appearance. And you can see that here, that plant just gets bound up in those soil particles and it actually won't emerge. So one of the worst things we can do is try to plant deep to moisture, especially if we're planting early in the year with warmer soil temperatures. You're better off, quote unquote, dusting that wheat in a little more shallow and trying to capture what moisture we get there through rainfall. Over here on the right, I do want to point out, again, we have lots of differences in the susceptibility of different varieties to soil temperature. All right, so some varieties are not really that affected by temperature. They have roughly the same length of coleoptile regardless of soil temp. However, some can be shortened drastically. Some of them can be less than 1 inch of coleoptile length, and those are the ones that we would have trouble getting out of the ground. So make sure you know your variety when you're picking those. That's another good reason to actually select varieties that are less heat sensitive. Planting date summary, and I added this in here for some of the dual purpose growers that we might have here today. Again, if you're sown at the same time, grazing reduced yield an average of 7%. Okay, so the grazing component itself is going to hurt grain yield about 7%. If we then add the early planting that we recommend for forage stands, we get another 7% penalty for early grazing. So in a dual purpose system where we plant early, we could potentially lose 14% of grain yield. If you're just looking at grazing itself, we're only going to lose about 7. If you're a graze-out grower, none of this matters. We need to go as early as we can there, somewhere around the 1st of September, to optimize fall forage production. These two I'm going to work on together, seeding rate and row spacing, and get these knocked out. And the biggest thing I think you need to take home from this is think about those leaves as a solar panel, because that's exactly what they are. They're capturing photons, capturing that sunlight intensity. The larger the panel, i.e. the larger the leaf, the more energy we can capture. Also, the faster we can build that leaf, build those solar panels, the more quickly we start to generate energy for the plant, and the faster we produce yield in that forage stand. Again, looking at decades of data. Oh, excuse me, this one's not. This was a single study. I got a little bit ahead of myself here. A single study at Goodwell, and they were looking at the addition of seed. If we add more seed to our planting rate, how does that affect production from a forage standpoint? And these are in comparison to a 1 bushel per acre seeding rate. So if we went to a 2 bushel per acre seeding rate, we got almost a 500-pound increase in fall forage production. If we went to a 3 bushel seeding rate, we got another 400 pounds of additional yield in the fall. Why are we seeing that? The reason we're seeing that is because we're putting more solar panels out there to capture that sunlight as it comes down towards the soil surface. I'll show you that in a picture. If you think about these as young plants in that field, again, there's a whole lot of soil around here absorbing sun radiation, but we're not actively using those photons, that sunlight, for photosynthesis. So just simply by doubling the plant population, we can start to close the canopy faster. And the faster we close the canopy, the more of that sunlight we capture, and therefore the more yield we make. So plant population is important, and typically we do see a payout from going up around that 2 to even 2.5 bushel planting rate for a dedicated forage stand. Let me show you one more thing. Now this would be for row spacing. You'll see a lot of data that says change your row spacing, go to a narrow row spacing. The problem is a lot of us have a planter that's set. We're not going to be able to easily change the row spacing. What we can change though is the way that we plant these fields. So again, this is an example of maybe where we run 1 bushel planting rate north and south, 1 bushel planting rate east and west. Yes, it doubles our passes across the field. That does incur more cost for us as well. But I want you to notice here we have this 7.5-inch square between rows. These plants basically have to creep about 3.75 inches across these open areas before we get complete canopy closure. So is that better than a single straight row? Yes, it would be. It would be faster canopy closure than just a single straight row across a field. But here's another option that you might consider, and that's actually running that second pass at an angle. Now, the neat thing about this is if you look, there's actually only one spot here where we're 7.5 inches between plants, and that's kind of in the middle part of this diamond shape. What we would see is actually less than 10% of the plants have to grow over 3.5 inches before it touches its neighbor plant. Most of these plants in this area here would not have to grow near as far before we get canopy closure. And again, that is how we're capturing that sunlight. So just some things to think about as far as row spacing, or I should say row orientation, and how we can speed up that process to capture the maximum amount of solar radiation. All right, winding on down to the end, fertility, of course, is extremely important. I think what we need to remember is when we look at lots of data, this again is one that has decades of data included in it. What we do see from a forage standpoint, and now this is assuming about 3 cents per pound of wheat forage and about 30 cents per pound of nitrogen, our break even normally is going to be somewhere around 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen at planting. That's what we would recommend for optimum forage production in the fall. Again, some people run no nitrogen up front. I feel like you're leaving some forage on the table that you could have picked up with a little bit of nitrogen at planting or shortly after planting. pH is also going to be important to us. What we do know is there's lots of varietal differences in pH tolerance, just like what we talked about with heat sensitivity. You can see back here behind this white dotted line, this was limed soil. In front of the white dotted line is non-limed soil, and you do see drastic differences in these varieties. So again, picking that correct variety for forage is paramount. That's going to help you a lot. Anytime we're getting down below about a 5.5 on pH, it's probably time to start thinking about lime, especially if we're more interested in forage than we are in grain. Again, here's one other one. This was a lot of data went into this as well. This is kind of a summary of multiple trials over many years. And I can't recommend this enough to someone if they tell me that their phosphorus is below 65 on the P index, or if their pH is below a 5.5, DAP, diammonium phosphate, in the furrow with the seed will boost fall yield. We see that repeatedly all across the state if you meet one of those two parameters. And the reason is, not only do we get starter phosphorus in that root zone of that plant, which helps that seedling take off and grow a good root system, explore and find new nutrients and find moisture at depth, but as we break a diammonium phosphate prill down in the soil, we actually elevate the pH in that band for a short amount of time. So it actually acts like a liming material in the soil. The plant doesn't feel the full effect of that soil acidity for a short amount of time. So it's a really good avenue to boost those fall yields. We don't recommend going over 60 pounds of DAP in furrow per acre at planting. You can hit a point where we start to see some burn on those young seedlings as they come out of the ground. So somewhere around 50 pounds, 60 pounds, that would be the top end of what we would recommend. To summarize all that, again, 40 to 60 pounds of N up front is going to be probably ideal for you based on environmental conditions that we can't predict. Monitor that pH anytime it starts falling below 5.5. If your P index is below 65 or pH is below 5.5, DAP in furrow will increase fall yields. Last but not least, I'm going to touch briefly on varieties and then turn this over to Dr. Beck. Again, this chart here is a little bit older. This was some varieties that were really popular here, especially Duster was used on a lot of acreage across Oklahoma 8, 10, 12 years ago. It is still a good grazing variety if you can find it, but we have others, and I'll show you that here in just a minute. But for the ranchers that are wanting to grow good small grain forage, good wheat forage, number one on the list is going to be, let's pick a variety that doesn't have those high temperature germination issues. We need very low sensitivity to heat. That way we can plant a little deeper, have that long coleoptile, and get us out of the ground. We do need to look at forage potential. Tillering potential is definitely going to help us out a lot, filling that canopy in. Late first hollow stem dates are typically going to be a good thing for us. That gives us a longer grazing period, especially if we're concerned with dual purpose wheat that we might harvest for grain. We don't have a tremendous amount of data on our varieties for yields after grazing, although that is something we are talking about right now that we may do some more research on here in the near future. And then last but not least, potentially awnless varieties would be more appealing to those producers that want to bale wheat hay. Maybe we let that wheat head out and get to late milk or early doe stage before belling? If so, we have some good on-list varieties now that meet a lot of these parameters. Current varieties that we're looking at in trials would be OK Corral, Green Hammer, High Cotton would be another one that could really be some good forage production potential for you. Quick plug on this. This is something I'm working on. I've got this in 6 different locations across the body of the state of Oklahoma. We're looking basically at wheat, cereal rye, triticale, barley, oats, and for the eastern locations, we do have annual ryegrass in there as well. As you can see, we have multiple varieties that we're assessing. We're trying to monitor full season yields, so growth from planting all the way until early May versus a winter graze out type option. So we should have data on that as we get into next year. Also, we will be assessing some spring planted options as well in oats, as well as in some of our triticale varieties. So that's all data we'll have next year. Last but not least, this is a question I got a lot this fall. You know, what do we do about armyworms? What I would tell you is armyworm problems are real. They were definitely a major issue this year, but to me, that's not enough reason to not plant small grain forages early in the fall. We need to get those in early September. We have really good low cost insecticide options now. We actually have some preventative options as well with products such as Dimlin that could be put down and actually pick up those very young instars of caterpillars before they do much damage. So again, there are ways that we can get ahead of fall armyworm. Work with your county extension educator. We'll be glad to share this with you that has all the different insecticides that might be an option for you. But those producers that actually got out there and got those stands planted early, again, just think about it. We captured that moisture, we captured sunlight, we had good heat, growing degree days, so to speak, on those plants. And if we could keep the armyworms away from it, we're already grazing cattle on it. So those are some keys I would tell you would be very important for fall forage production in small grain stands.
Thank you, Brian.
Dr. Beck, I'll turn it over to you. I'll stop sharing here.
Okay, I have 2 really brief questions for you that
Okay.
if you're no-tilling wheat into Bermuda grass, would you want to plant wait a little longer to plant to avoid competition from the grass?
Okay, so that's a 10-second question with a 10-minute answer. Very quickly, what I would say, if I want to maximize fall forage production in my small grain stand, so I need that grazing in December, January, February, I would plant early and suppress the sod. So we do recommend using a herbicide like paraquat to suppress Bermuda grass and give that small grain stand the advantage. If I don't need the grazing until spring, February, March, April, you could drill that in and not worry about suppressing the sod. We could drill it early, or we could even drill it this late in the year. We know we'll make good yields by late spring. We just can't count on very much yield in the middle of winter.
And I had another clarification question. On the rye, are you asking or talking about when you say cereal rye, hybridized rye, which I'm not sure.
Probably a ryegrass question, I'm guessing.
Yep.
Yes, so that is one thing that we all need to be careful of when we talk about rye, quote unquote. So when I showed the graphs earlier with the wheat that Dr. Beck had put together and rye, that was cereal rye. That needs to be drilled in. Annual ryegrass, again, is a weed in wheat, a major weed out in western Oklahoma, but it's used extensively in eastern Oklahoma and can be broadcast on top of the ground. We don't normally make a lot of fall forage production with annual ryegrass stands. Most of that production is in the spring.
Okay.
Hopefully that answered that.
Yep, that's great. I'm going to go on and we have some other questions that will be coming in, but I'm going to share my screen and get through my part of the presentation in light of time. So with that, thank you very much, Brian. good stuff, and I think it's stuff that we need to hear now, and we have examples of the implications of our decisions early. And it's something we can use earlier next year potentially to get our timing right on planning to sit those situations. So as I said at the outset of the webinar, we've got a real range of forage conditions. We've got some producers that planted early, we're able to keep the armyworms out. Like here on the left, this is about 1,800 pounds of forage per acre, about 9 inches in height, and just a really good stand. Got cattle grazing out already. All the way to here's a picture that was sent to us from an area specialist just outside of Cordell, out in western Oklahoma. This is about what we'd expect in a decent wheat pasture year by this time of the year. We've already got cattle out. We're looking at about 1,000 pounds to 1,200 pounds of forage dry matter per acre. And then this picture that I actually got it off the internet a few years ago. Not an ideal situation. There's more than just that calf's genetics holding it back from producing gain on this wheat pasture. It is technically on wheat pasture, but there's just not a lot of forage dry matter to drive intake, and essentially dry matter intake, even of something like wheat pasture, is what drives performance. An example of what can happen whenever we have different levels of forage accumulation or graze it down. We did a study several years ago where we looked at 3 different levels of forage depletion, and this was in a no-till stand into a crop field. But we looked at an ungrazed sward that was about 8 inches in average leaf height. We would call that about 1,600 pounds of forage dry matter per acre. An area where we grazed it fairly short, down to about 5.5 inches of average leaf height. This would be about 1,100 pounds of forage dry matter per acre. And a high depletion where they grazed it down really hard before we did this test, and it's down around 2 to 3 inches of average leaf height. This was 2 3/4 inches is what they measured with this. So about 500 pounds of forage dry matter per acre. When we look at the green leaf yield, as we increase the depletion, we vastly decrease the amount of green leaf out there per acre, in pounds per acre, and also the amount of stem for this fall wheat pasture. So this was in the fall and early winter, not after stem elongation. So these stems are not what we think of as a true stem as far as nutritionally. Leaf to stem ratio actually was calculated to increase as we got into that higher depletion, just because those leaves that are growing out there more laterally, less available to grazing. The great thing about fall and winter wheat pasture is, even though it does technically decrease in quality, decreases in crude protein and digestibility of that sward, going from ungrazed, where 23% crude protein and 90% digestible, we grazed about a third of that, and we just got it down to about 19% crude protein and 90% digestibility. And then whenever we severely depleted that, even though we have quite a bit of stem that would be the grazeable portion of that, we're still at 19% crude protein and 90% digestibility. So, we can really graze this down. It's, these cool season annuals are a really highly nutritious crop in the fall and winter, even though stems are way more digestible and have a lot more protein than a growing calf would really need. What we did with this trial is we set up some corridors for steers to graze. And then when we turned them into those, we looked at their grazing behavior and saw how that changed as we increased the depletion or decreased the amount of forage available to those steers. Whenever we look at dry matter intake per feeding station, or every time those calves stop and start grazing, they will take bites out of a horizon that they could reach. Our dry matter intake per feeding station decreases as we increase the depletion or decrease the amount of forage available. The eating steps per minute, or as they're grazing, how many steps they take per minute of grazing, increases quite a lot. The eating distance, because they're stepping more, also about almost 2.5 times more distance, and about 3 times or 2.5 times more area grazed in square foot for these grazing bouts. And then the bite rate changes. So these steers are adapting their grazing behavior to sustain forage intake and diet quality. They're doing in short-term grazing activity, they're changing that so that they can still, get as much forage in a highly depleted sward as an ungrazed sward or a sward with a large amount of forage availability. When we get to something like this on the upper right-hand side, they cannot make enough changes in the short-term grazing dynamics to make up for the forage, the low level of forage that's available. They just cannot get enough intake to fulfill their dietary needs as far as the amount of forage they consume. So we've, years ago, Dr. Larry Redmond, when he was working here at Oklahoma State University, published some research in 1995 where the maximum forage intake is right at 1,200 pounds of forage dry matter per acre. If once we hit that point, which would be about a 6-inch tall stand, once we hit that point, then forage intake per day decreases, and that starts impacting the level of performance. And that plays into a lot of this research that we've been putting together. This is over about 10 years of wheat pasture research, where each one of these points on this graph on the right is the average daily gain for a pasture where those steers were stocked at a forage allowance, or the pounds of forage dry matter per pound of calf body weight throughout this study or series of studies. And the break point, or the critical point where we start influencing the amount of gain, if we go below that, we'll start decreasing gain. If we go above that, we're not going to be able to get any more gain, just because the cattle will not be able to eat anymore, or they won't have the genetic capacity to gain more, is 5 pounds of available forage dry matter per pound of animal body weight at initial turnout. If we look at this averaged over the grazing season, that decreases slightly to about 3.5, but the general shape of this curve is identical along with all the data points. When we get below that point, our average daily gain at 2.5 pounds of forage dry matter per pound of steer body weight is about 2 pounds a day. But the variability in that gets to be very wide, going all the way down from close to 1 pound a day all the way up to about 3 pounds a day. And a lot of that has to do with the conditions of the sward whenever the cattle go out. Mathematically, if you have several acres and a low yield or forage dry matter biomass, then you're going to impact performance just because there's not that 1,200 pounds of forage available per acre for total intake. And if we have good growing conditions and a good yield and a higher stocking rate, we may have higher performance from those animals. And as we get above that, with over 5 pounds of forage allowance per animal or per pound, then that variability kind of goes away. So as we see, at about 5 pounds of forage dry matter per acre, we go from 2 pounds of potential average daily gain up to about 2.75 pounds of average daily gain. So this is about, for a 500-pound calf, 1,250 pounds of forage dry matter per calf, up to about 2,500 pounds. And I use the break point, the easiest to find, of about 1,000 pounds of forage dry matter per acre, so that we have lots of leaf area, as Brian talked about, for continual growth through the winter, and also the intake ability of those animals. So we're talking about that 5 to 6 inches of plant height on the average leaf. So this would be the ultimate example that what we're actually looking for trying to maximize animal performance. So we took those numbers and we wanted to test it. So we did a 2-year experiment where we set our stocking rate based on the forage allowance concept. And we used some lightweight calves that weighed about 4 1/4 and some heavyweight calves that weighed about 6 1/4. And we based this on acres per steer, going equal number of acres per steer or stocking rate, or basing the stocking rate on forage allowance only. So in those 2 years, our initial forage yield, we had one really good year and one kind of decent year where we had 1,900 pounds of forage dry matter per acre in year 1, 1,300 pounds of forage dry matter per acre in year 2. And we stocked these heavy steers at 1 acre per steer, and did that with the light steers as well. Our forage allowance went from about 2.5 to 3 with the heavy steers to about 4 to just over 5 pounds of forage allowance for the light steers. And then when we stocked the light steers based on an equal forage allowance to those heavy steers, they were that same 2 to 3 pounds of forage per pound of animal body weight. And these trials started in early November in the first year, the good forage year. The second year, we had to wait until mid-December to start the trial. So when we, this is one of those things where it actually worked out, where if we increase the forage allowance of those lighter animals, we got about 2 3/4 pounds of gain per day with those steers. With those heavy steers, on the average of those 2 years, and with those light stocked at the same forage allowance, right at 2.5 pounds per day. When we carried over into the spring, we really didn't see an influence of those stocking rates going into the spring, except for where we had more animals on this forage allowance based on the light cattle. We did decrease our average daily gain during the spring, just because there was a little bit less forage available at the start of graze out, and that decreased our forage production at that time. So whenever we put this together, and if we have adequate forage to stock steers, and we would plan on going with our normal stocking rate or even a higher stocking rate, you know, we have really good pasture, you know, we could, you know, even look at, you know, 1 steer per acre, for instance, in some of these areas in central Oklahoma that got some good production. Eastern Oklahoma, I've seen some. What would happen based on our gross margins and the value of gain compared to November of 2022 and what we're projecting using the current feeder cattle market or price of feeder cattle in Oklahoma or stocker cattle in Oklahoma, and projected sales based on the futures price. The value of gain is still relatively attractive at here we have the ultimate end. You know, in 2022, when the surge increase in prices started, you know, those calves were just a little under $2 a pound for a 5 weight, costing about $970. When they sold at 800 pounds, they brought, you know, the slide on those cattle was only down to about $1.85. That 300 pounds of gain gave us a value of gain of about $1.70. And looking at a cost of gain for those animals at about 70 cents per pound, that gave us a 30% return on investment. In today's numbers, we're looking at a 124% increase in the beginning price of those animals, up to about $2,200 a head. We're looking at a 71% increase in the ending price or the ending value, up to about $2,500 a head. There's still a really nice potential for profitability, but the value of gain is 30% less than it was in 2022. And if we look at the you know, cost at 70 cents per pound of gain, that return on investment is only about 6 to 7% for that. So when we model this in current situations, looking at 2.5 pounds of forage allowance, getting 2 pounds a day, if our value of gain is $1.70, in today's market, we should expect a return on investment of about 14%. If we expand the stocking rate or have a lower stocking rate, a higher forage allowance, and hit that 5 pounds of forage per pound of animal body weight, the targeted average daily gain we would expect would be about 2.75 pounds per day. That would give us in today's market a 23% return on investment, $490 net return per head. Using today's value of gain at $1.20 gives us right at $284, up from $150 per head. So around a 14% return on investment in that situation. So that could be very attractive to have fewer calves and more performance per animal. If we are short on pasture, there are things we can do. We have lots of hay this year, and I'm going to just briefly talk about some trials where we fed hay or different forage products to meet those gain requirements. Here's where we fed a moderate quality forage. It's a Bermuda grass haylage, but there's no reason why just a Bermuda grass hay wouldn't work. We had a control that was not fed haylage. Stocking rate was the same as the control, 1.5 times that of control, and 2 times that of control. So our forage allowance went from right at 2.1 down to 1.6 and 1.35 for fall production. The haylage we used was 14% crude protein and about 60% TDN. So fairly good, good quality Bermuda grass forage for this. Our animal performance in the fall is where we're going to target this. Really good performance, even with right at 2.1 forage allowance on the controls. They gained 2.8 pounds per day. When we fed that moderate quality hay with that, it increased up to 3.2, close to 3.2 pounds of gain per day. So there was a potential positive associative effect by feeding that moderate quality forage to go along with that wheat pasture. When we increased the stocking rate by 50%, got up equal to our controls when we fed haylage. And even when we increased our stocking rate or decreased our forage allowance down to 1.6 pounds per animal or per animal body weight, we still got 2.5 pounds of gain per acre or per steer. So, we got about 8 or 10 pounds of haylage, dry matter offered per increase in average daily gain per acre. If we have, this is a tool we can use if we have short wheat pasture to keep our stocking rates where we would normally want them. So in conclusion, we can decrease stocking rates on wheat pasture, and it can be beneficial to increase individual average daily gain, decrease that variability in average daily gain, which would also lead to decreased risk and increased return on investment with those higher performances. If we're short on pasture, we can feed that moderate quality forage to go along with that and maintain or increase performance per acre. And when the value of gain on those stockers was $1.12 per pound, that dry matter, forage dry matter only needed to be about 17 cents per pound, or could be up to 17 cents per pound to break even. So with the large amount of hay we have available in Oklahoma, this could be a fairly cheap way to maintain stocking rates on short wheat pasture. So with that, we'll look at entertaining any questions. We have one in the Q&A. Brian, this one would be for you. If I didn't plant early and the moisture isn't lost, or if we've maintained the soil moisture, it's essentially stored in the soil, will spring forage yield be greater if you're planted late?
Probably, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I don't know that I've got any data on that, but I would go out on a limb here and say most likely not. I think that's where we want to go with some of our future research here, is looking at regrowth after grazing, and then also looking at how even, late fall or spring planting dates affect forage growth in the spring. So I did have some trials a few years back where we were looking at even late fall planted stands compared to February planted stands of spring forages. And the spring forages were always behind what was planted the fall before, because we developed a secondary root system the fall before. Those plants were just physiologically ahead of wherever we would plant later. So again, I don't know that I have hard data right now on the top of my head. Paul might, but I would still say you're going to be money ahead to plant in the fall with moisture now, try to get it up, and potentially make more yield next spring. We could fertilize somewhere around Valentine's Day, mid-February, and start to actually put some real yield on those plants instead of waiting until potentially that point to even plant. So, Paul, do you have any hard data on that y'all looked at Arkansas?
I am familiar with some. I don't have that available right now. But there, in Arkansas, I know there was quite a few demonstrations that the Forages group did. Kenny Simon and John Jennings did just a few years ago that I think pretty much dovetails with what you just said.
It's hard to beat the early planting. We just get that plant physiologically further ahead.